Sign the papers, my brother said with a slow, confident smile that did not belong to the boy I had grown up protecting and loving. I stood there frozen in the lawyer's office staring at him as if he were a stranger wearing my brother's face. The room felt too quiet, too cold, too heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on my chest. I looked at the papers in my hands and the words blurred for a moment before coming back into focus, each line sharper than the last, each sentence cutting deeper than. I was ready to admit this was not a simple form, this was not a routine signature, this was everything our father had built, everything he had trusted us with, everything that carried his name and his dreams reduced to a few sheets of paper waiting for my surrender. My fingers trembled slightly as I held them and I forced myself to breathe, but it felt like something inside me was already collapsing. You know, this is what Dad wanted, he continued, leaning back in his chair like he had already won. Like this moment was nothing more than a small formality. I turned my head slowly toward him, searching his eyes for even the smallest trace of hesitation or guilt, but there was nothing, only confidence, only calculation, only that same smirk that now felt unbearable. This is, I am giving up my share, I said quietly, my voice barely steady. The house, the land, everything. He exhaled as if I were being difficult, as if I were the problem in this situation. Do not make this complicated, he replied, his tone calm but sharp underneath. You do not even live there, you have your apartment, your life. I will manage everything, you will still be taken care of. Those words echoed in my mind, taken care of, like I was some burden, like I was someone who needed permission to exist, like everything I had done for him meant nothing now. Memories rushed in all at once, moments I had not thought about in years, nights when I stayed awake while he slept peacefully after crying himself to sleep when our mother died. Mornings when I packed his lunch and made sure he got to school while I sacrificed my own opportunities so he would never feel the weight of what we had lost. I had been there through everything, every fall, every failure, every fear. And I had never once asked for anything in return, because that was what family meant to me. It was not a transaction, it was not control, it was love and loyalty without conditions. And yet here I was standing across from him, realizing that somewhere along the way he had learned a different meaning. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice softer now but heavier with something deeper than confusion, something closer to heartbreak. He did not even hesitate, his smile widened slightly as if he had been waiting for that question. Because I can, he said simply, and in that moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a crack forming deep within something that had once been strong. I glanced at the lawyer, hoping for some interruption, some sign that this was wrong, but he kept his eyes on the table, avoiding mine, as if silence would erase his role in all of this. That was when I understood this had been decided long before I walked into that room. This was not a conversation, this was not a negotiation, this was a setup, and I was the only one who had not known the truth until now. The weight of that realization settled into my chest, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. I looked down at the papers again, and this time I read them carefully, each line, each clause, each word confirming what I already knew. I was being erased from my own story, removed from the life my father had built, not because I had failed, not because I had chosen to leave, but because my own brother had decided I no longer belonged there. A strange calm began to replace the storm inside me, not peace, not acceptance, but something colder, something sharper, something that allowed me to think clearly despite the pain. I lifted the pen slowly and held it above the paper for a moment, longer than necessary, as if time itself might pause and give me a different ending. But there was no interruption, no miracle, no sudden change of heart from him. There was only silence waiting for my decision. I could fight, I could argue, I could refuse and create a scene that might drag on for days or weeks, but deep down I knew it would not change the truth. This was not about convincing him, this was about understanding who he had become and what I needed to do next. I lowered the pen and signed my name slowly, deliberately, each stroke steady despite everything I felt inside. The sound of the pen moving across the paper seemed louder than anything else in the room. When I finished, I placed the pen down gently and slid the papers back across the table toward him. He reached for them immediately, his smirk returning in full as he glanced over my signature, like it was confirmation of his victory, like everything had gone exactly as planned. He did not notice the way I looked at him in that moment. He did not notice the silence that followed or the shift in the air, because to him this was the end of something, but to me it was only the beginning. I stood up without saying another word, the chair scraping softly against the floor, breaking the stillness. As I turned toward the door, I felt his eyes on me, but he said nothing. Perhaps he thought there was nothing left to say. Perhaps he believed I had already accepted my place in the story he had written for me, but he was wrong. As I reached the door, I paused for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to let the reality settle in fully. I had lost my inheritance, my home, my connection to the past that had shaped me, but I had not lost myself, and that was something he had failed to understand completely. I stepped out into the hallway, and the door closed behind me with a quiet final sound that marked the end of everything we had been and the beginning of something neither of us was prepared for. Outside the building the world continued as if nothing had happened. People walked by, cars passed, voices filled the air, but it all felt distant, like I was watching it from somewhere far away. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, grounding myself in the present moment, because there was no going back, no undoing what had just been done. There was only forward, and as I stood there I realized something that should have terrified me but instead brought a strange sense of clarity. I had nothing left to lose, and that meant I had everything left to build. From that moment on, my life would no longer be tied to his decisions or controlled by his choices. It would be mine, entirely shaped by my own actions, my own strength, my own resilience. And as painful as that realization was, it also carried a quiet power, one that I had never needed before but would now become my greatest weapon. I walked away without looking back, not because it did not hurt, but because I knew that if I turned around I might see the brother I used to love instead of the man he had become, and I could not afford that weakness anymore. Not now, not after everything that had just happened. The past was gone, and so was the version of me who had believed that loyalty alone could protect what mattered most. And as I stepped forward into an uncertain future, I carried that lesson with me, not as a burden but as a promise that I would never again allow someone else to decide my worth or my place in the world. The silence after losing everything was louder than any argument I had ever heard. It followed me home, sat beside me in my small apartment, and stared back at me every time I tried to distract myself from the truth that my own brother had erased me from the life I once knew. The walls felt closer than before, the space smaller, the future uncertain in a way that made every breath feel heavier than it should have been. For the first few days I did nothing but sit there, replaying the moment again and again. The sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, the cold certainty in his words. It did not feel real. It felt like something that had happened to someone else, and yet the emptiness around me proved otherwise. I had no land, no house, no safety net, no family left to lean on. There was only me and the quiet realization that I had been left behind on purpose. But something strange began to happen. Beneath the pain, beneath the anger, beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else, something small but steady, like a light refusing to go out no matter how dark it became. And I started to understand that losing everything had not broken me. It had stripped away every excuse, every dependency, every illusion that I needed someone else to survive. I forced myself to stand up one morning, even though my body resisted, even though my mind told me to stay where it was safe, where I did not have to face reality. I stepped forward anyway. I opened my laptop and began searching for anything, any work, any opportunity, any way to move even an inch away from the person I had been. The rejection came quickly and often, messages left unanswered, offers that paid almost nothing, tasks that felt endless and meaningless, but I took them all because I knew something he did not know. I knew what it felt like to start with nothing. I had done it before, when our mother died, when I had to grow up overnight, when I had to become strong before I even understood what strength meant, and that memory became my anchor. Every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself that I had survived worse, that I had endured more than this, that I had built a life once and I could do it again. The days blurred together. Work replaced rest, effort replaced comfort, and slowly, almost quietly, things began to shift. A small payment turned into a slightly bigger one, a single client turned into a regular one, a routine began to form, and with it came a sense of control that I had not felt in a long time. It was not easy, it was not fast, but it was real, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. There were nights when I fell asleep at my desk, too tired to even think, mornings when I woke up with doubt pressing against my chest like a weight that refused to lift. But I kept going because every step forward was proof that I did not need what I had lost to become something more than I had been before. And in the middle of all that effort, I began to change, not just in what I did, but in how I saw myself. I was no longer the person who waited for approval or depended on others to decide my value. I was building something with my own hands, something that could not be taken away with a signature or a lie, and that realization became stronger with each passing day. I started taking risks, small at first, then bigger ones. Ideas that I would have ignored before suddenly felt possible because I had nothing left to protect and everything left to gain. One opportunity led to another, a collaboration turned into a partnership, and before I could fully process it, I found myself standing at the edge of something new, something I had never imagined for myself, a chance to create something of my own, a business that was not tied to family or inheritance, but to effort and vision and belief. I hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward because I knew that fear had no place in the life I was trying to build, and as I committed to that path, I felt something shift inside me. Again, not like the quiet crack from before, but like something rebuilding, stronger than it had ever been. At the same time, whispers about my brother began to reach me through distant connections and shared acquaintances. At first I ignored them because I did not want to be pulled back into his world, but the stories kept coming too consistent to dismiss, too revealing to ignore. He had sold parts of the land, quickly chasing profit instead of stability. He had invested in things he did not understand, trusted people who saw his confidence as an opportunity rather than a strength. The money that had once seemed endless began to shrink faster than anyone expected, and the life he had built on that false foundation started to show its cracks. I listened without reacting, without judgment, without satisfaction, because what I felt was not happiness at his downfall. It was something more complicated, something quieter. I understood now that the same arrogance that had led him to take everything from me was the same arrogance that was now taking everything from him, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, even if I wanted to, because this was a lesson he had to learn on his own, just as I had learned mine alone in that small apartment with nothing but determination and silence to guide me. The difference was that I had chosen to build something real while he had chosen to rely on something temporary, and as time passed, the gap between us grew wider, not in distance, but in who we were becoming. I was no longer chasing what had been taken from me. I was creating something new, something stronger, something that belonged entirely to me, and with that came a sense of peace that I had not expected, a quiet confidence that did not need validation or approval because it was rooted in experience and effort and truth. I no longer thought about the papers or the loss or the betrayal with the same intensity because they no longer defined me. They had become part of my story, but not the whole of it, and that was the greatest change of all. I had moved from survival to growth, from reaction to intention, from being someone who was hurt to someone who was building something meaningful. And as I stood in that new reality, I realized that the person who had walked out of that lawyer's office was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and far more dangerous in ways my brother would never fully understand, because this version of me did not depend on anyone, did not fear loss, and did not forget the lessons that had shaped it. I had turned pain into fuel, failure into foundation, and betrayal into clarity, and that transformation was something no one could take away from me, no matter how hard they tried, because it was not given to me. It was earned step by step, day by day, moment by moment, in the quiet rise that no one saw coming, and by the time the world began to notice, it was already too late to stop it. The night he came back into my life did not feel real at first. It felt like a memory trying to return without permission. The rain was heavy outside, the kind that blurred lights and turned the world into something distant and unreachable. I was sitting alone going through work when a knock came, slow, uneven, almost hesitant. I remember thinking it was strange because no one ever came to my door, not anymore. I had built a life that was quiet, controlled, untouched by the chaos I had left behind, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but something about the sound pulled me in a direction I could not explain. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, each step carrying a weight I did not understand yet. When I opened it, everything stopped. He stood there in front of me, but he was not the same person I had seen in that office weeks ago. The confidence was gone, the sharpness in his eyes replaced with something fragile, something broken. His clothes were wrinkled, his posture uncertain, his entire presence smaller, like life had stripped away the illusion he once carried so proudly. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other as if trying to recognize what was left of the past and the people we had become. His lips parted slightly before he finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "Can I come in?" he asked, and that simple question carried more weight than anything he had ever said before, because it was not a demand, it was not control, it was a request, and I could hear something unfamiliar in it, something close to fear. I did not answer right away. I let the silence stretch between us, not to punish him, but because I needed to understand what I was feeling in that moment. This was the same person who had taken everything from me without hesitation, the same person who had looked at me like I was nothing more than an obstacle, and now he stood here with nothing, asking for something he had never valued. Before a chance, I stepped aside without a word, and he walked and slowly, almost carefully, as if he did not belong there. His eyes moved around the apartment, taking in the space, the simplicity, the order, and I could see the shift in his expression, a mix of surprise and something deeper, something like realization. "You are doing okay," he said quietly, and there was no sarcasm in his tone, no arrogance, only truth. "I am," I replied, and those two words held everything I had built, everything I had endured, everything he had never expected. Silence filled the room again. Heavier this time, more honest. He stood there for a moment before his shoulders dropped and something inside him finally gave way. He sat down suddenly, like his strength had run out, and then it happened. The walls he had built around himself shattered in front of me. "I messed up," he said, his voice breaking as he looked down at his hands. "I lost everything." The words came out slowly, like they hurt to say, like each one carried the weight of a mistake. He could no longer hide the land, the money, it is all gone. He continued, his breathing uneven, his thoughts scattered. "They tricked me. I trusted the wrong people. I thought I understood what I was doing." He let out a weak laugh that held no humor, only regret. I thought I was smarter than everyone else. His hands tightened slightly as if he was trying to hold onto something that no longer existed. I thought I deserved it more than you. That sentence lingered in the air longer than the others, heavier, more painful, because it was not just about loss. It was about truth, a truth he had never admitted before. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that came from understanding how far I had come, because there was a time when seeing him like this would have broken me, when I would have rushed to fix everything to protect him from the consequences of his choices. But that version of me no longer existed, and he seemed to realize that as he looked up at me, his eyes filled with something raw, something real. "I thought you would always be there," he said quietly, and that sentence hit deeper than everything else, not because it hurt, but because it revealed everything he had taken for granted. Every moment he had assumed I would remain the same no matter what he did to me. The room felt smaller as his words settled into the space between us, because once he had been right, once I would have been there without question, without hesitation. But that was before the papers, before the betrayal, before I learned what it meant to choose myself instead of losing everything for someone who never valued it. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression filled with frustration and regret. "I do not have anywhere else to go," he added, his voice softer now, almost defeated. "Everyone I trusted disappeared when the money was gone. I do not even know what to do anymore." I let his words sink in before responding, because this moment mattered more than he understood. It was not just about what I would say, it was about who I had become and what I was willing to allow into my life. Now I took a slow breath and stepped closer, not out of sympathy but out of clarity. "You made your choices," I said calmly, and there was no anger in my voice, no accusation, only truth. He nodded immediately, as if he had expected nothing else, as if he knew there was no argument left to make. "I know," he whispered, his eyes dropping again. "I know I ruined everything." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not empty, it was filled with something that had never existed between us before: accountability. And as I stood there looking at him, I realized that this was the moment everything had been leading to, not his downfall, not his suffering, but this understanding, this shift from arrogance to awareness, from control to vulnerability. And yet even then I did not feel powerful, I did not feel victorious. I felt steady, grounded in a way I had never been before, because my life was no longer connected to his rise or fall. I was no longer defined by his actions or his choices. I had stepped outside that cycle and built something of my own, something that could not be shaken by his presence at my door. And as I looked at him one last time, I knew that whatever happened next would not be about revenge. It would be about truth, about boundaries, about the person I had fought so hard to become, and the life I was no longer willing to lose for anyone again, not even him. I stood there looking at him as the weight of everything settled into the room, and for the first time since he walked in, I truly understood that this moment was not about him anymore. It was about me. It was about who I had become and what I would choose to do with the power I had rebuilt from nothing. He sat there waiting for something, anything, a sign that I would step back into the role he had always known, the one who fixed his mistakes, the one who carried his burdens, the one who gave without limits. But that version of me was gone, and he could see it in my eyes, even if he did not fully understand it yet. I took a slow breath and let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it, not as punishment, but as truth, because for once he needed to sit in the reality of his own actions, without escape, without interruption, without someone rushing in to soften the consequences. "I am not going to give you money," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, and clear. His head dropped slightly, not in surprise, but in acceptance, as if he had expected that answer, even if part of him had hoped for something different. I continued before he could speak, because this was not a conversation that could be guided by emotion alone. "And I am not going to fix what you broke." The words landed exactly as they needed to, not harsh, not cruel, but firm enough to leave no space for misunderstanding. He nodded slowly, his hands tightening for a moment before relaxing again, as if he was letting go of the last piece of hope that things could return to what they were. But I was not finished, because despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the loss, I was not someone who believed in leaving people in the dark without a way forward. I had learned too much, I had grown too much to respond with bitterness alone. "But I will give you something else," I said, and that made him look up again, his eyes searching mine, trying to understand what I meant, trying to find something familiar in the person standing in front of him. I turned and walked toward the small table near the window, where I kept a few papers neatly arranged, not because I needed to, but because I had learned the value of order in a life that once felt chaotic. I picked up a simple envelope and held it for a moment before walking back toward him and handing it over. He hesitated before taking it, like he was unsure if he deserved even that small gesture, and maybe he was right, but this was not about what he deserved, it was about what I chose to give. He opened it slowly, his fingers careful, as if the paper inside might disappear if he moved too fast. When he looked down, his expression shifted, confusion first, then surprise, then something deeper, as he realized What he was holding, it was not money, not a shortcut, not a way to escape what he had done. It was a list of contacts, places, opportunities, small chances that could lead to something if he was willing to work for it, if he was willing to start over from nothing, just like I had. These are people who might give you a chance, I said, watching him closely, but only if you are willing to earn it. His grip on the paper tightened slightly as he processed my words, as he understood what I was offering and what I was refusing at the same time. You start from zero, I added, my tone unchanged, my resolve clear. No shortcuts, no expectations, no one to fall back on. You build something yourself or you lose it. Again he swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the list as if it carried more weight than anything he had held before, and in a way it did, because it represented something he had never truly experienced before, responsibility for his own life. He looked up at me again, his expression softer, now stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. Why, he asked quietly, his voice almost breaking. After everything I did, why are you helping me at all? The question hung in the air, heavy with confusion and something close to disbelief, because in his mind help had always come with control, with power, with obligation, but this was different. This was something he did not know how to measure. I held his gaze for a moment before answering, not with anger, not with pride, but with a quiet truth that had taken me everything to learn. Because I am not you, I said simply, and those words carried everything I had become, everything I had refused to let his actions destroy, everything I had rebuilt piece by piece through effort and pain and growth. His eyes filled again, but this time the tears were not just about loss, they were about understanding, about the realization that the person he had underestimated, the person he had tried to erase, had become someone far stronger than he had ever imagined. And in that moment I saw something change in him, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to matter, enough to give him a chance to become something different if he chose to take it. He nodded slowly, as if accepting not just the offer, but the reality behind it, the fact that there would be no easy way forward, no one to save him, no illusion to hide behind anymore. He stood up carefully, like he was carrying more than just the envelope, like he was carrying the weight of his own decisions for the first time. And as he moved toward the door, he paused for a second, his hand resting lightly on the handle. I do not know if I can fix this, he admitted without turning around, his voice honest in a way I had never heard before. I did not move, I did not soften my stance, because this was not the moment for reassurance, this was the moment for truth. You might not, I replied calmly, but that is not the point. The point is whether you are willing to try. He stood there for another second before nodding once more and opening the door. The sound of the rain outside filled the space briefly before he stepped out into it and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one that had followed me after the papers were signed. This silence was not empty, it was full of closure, full of clarity, full of something that felt like peace. I walked to the door and closed it gently, not with anger, not with regret, but with a sense of finality that I had not felt before, because I knew that whatever happened next was no longer tied to me. His journey was his own, just as mine had been from the moment I walked away from everything that once defined me. I turned back into the room and looked around at the life I had built, the small space that had become my foundation, the place where I had learned to stand on my own, without fear, without dependence, without waiting for someone else to decide my worth. And I felt something shift inside me again, not like the pain that had once driven me, not like the determination that had pushed me forward, but something quieter, something stronger, a sense of completion. I had not just survived what happened, I had transformed it. I had taken betrayal and turned it into clarity. I had taken loss and turned it into strength. I had taken everything that was meant to break me and used it to build something unshakable, and that was something no one could ever take from me, not my brother, not the past, not the world outside that door. I moved toward the window and looked out at the rain, watching as it continued to fall, steady and relentless, washing away everything in its path. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely still, completely certain that I had chosen the right path, not because it was easy, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. And as I stepped away from the window and turned off the light, I knew that the story did not end with his return or his regret. It ended with my decision to rise above it all, to become someone who could face betrayal without becoming it, someone who could offer a chance without losing themselves, someone who understood that the sweetest revenge was not in watching someone fall, but in building a life so strong, so independent, so complete that their fall no longer had the power to shake you. And in that truth I found everything I had been searching for, not in the past, not in what was taken from me, but in what I had created from nothing. And that was more than enough to move forward without ever looking back.